Well, Heather, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I've really been looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Mary. It's a pleasure, and I'm really honored to be here.
So I have been hearing so much about your training through my dear friend, Rachel Bilski, who's been completing her yoga therapy diploma at the Minded Institute. And she's just been blown away by the depth of the training, even as
Mhm.
someone who brings a lot of experience studying and teaching yoga before, and also has been so excited about the work that you're doing, as am I, in bringing yoga therapy into the healthcare space. So would you mind just giving a bit of an introduction to yourself and the work that you do at the Minded Institute?
Sure. So the introduction to myself can be long or it can be short. So maybe somewhere in the middle. Um, Firstly, I think it's useful to know that I always had this inclination towards spiritual practices, and particularly Eastern ones, various different Eastern practices since I was a child. And where that came from, I cannot say. Certainly not my family, certainly not my friends. It was like born within me. And I also suffered from mental health issues from the time I was 10 years old till 23. I wouldn't say that at 23, poof, they magically disappeared, but that was a seminal moment in my life. So, having suffered from depression, anxiety, and what I would later understand to be PTSD, I opted not to go down the route of being medicated, although I'm not anti-medication. And I think it's really important people know that. I come from New York City. Everybody I knew was on some kind of psychopharmaceutical drug in order to adjust their mood. And I wanted to do things differently. And I didn't know it then. Right? I had an undergraduate degree in anthropology. And under the guise of finding a culture that I would study with, I decided to travel around the world. I had a very limited understanding of meditation. When I would close my eyes, I would start to think negative things endlessly. And I had also practiced yoga already. I had done a semester abroad in India, but and where yoga was one of the courses that we did. But as an ex-gymnast, I just thought it was adult gymnastics. I didn't get it. Um, but anyway, I opted at the age of 23 to leave the life that I had in Manhattan and to go to Asia. And very quickly, meditation and yoga became my full-time path. I was in Korea. I went to this monastery. This Buddhist monk stopped me, asked me to stay in very broken English. I knew no Korean. And I guess it kind of started from there. I ended up spending 3 years living in Buddhist monasteries where I also practiced yoga. Took some time out to train as a yoga teacher during that time. And then I was going to become a Buddhist nun, actually. That was my goal. And in the UK, there was a master's degree in Buddhist Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies. It was the first year that they actually had this degree. And I thought, I've had various different teachers providing me with different insights as to what to practice. I need some textual clarity. And I had this totally this misconception that the Buddha had taught things that would be written down definitively, and all I needed to do was go to academia to read them and I would be clear. Well, of course, that's not what happens when you go back to a tradition that's 2,500 years old. You know, it's really a piecing together of what was really said or not really said and through which tradition. Following that, I went to teach yoga full time in Taiwan. And I had a lot of students who were coming to me with mental health issues. And I'd say, well, just go live in a monastery or an ashram and you'll be fine. And they'd kind of like, step back while still looking at me, that kind of thing before you run away. So you know that you're not being chased by an insane person. And it was clear I needed more skills. And I ended up coming back to the UK and doing a master's degree in psychotherapy. In fact, it was a Buddhist-based psychotherapy. I found myself frustrated, though, because talking therapy was not my inroads to healing. And so I felt like a fraud. And that is not to say that I don't see value in it, but there's something about being the wounded healer and then using a healing modality that is not related to what you used yourself in order to find peace and ease. So I went and I trained, I took sabbatical as a yoga therapist. And whilst I was doing that in India, it was very clear to me that I should be working with mental health. I mean, first of all, I was completing a master's degree in psychotherapy. I knew about mental health really clearly from my own experience in an embodied way. And so I came back from that training and I developed an 8-week course for anxiety and depression. And in the same time, my training in yoga therapy had been making a lot of grand claims that didn't have any foundation, I felt, in science. And having been both helpless and hopeless, I could not echo those claims without them having some scientific underpinnings. And so I actually went to study neuroscience at a master's degree at that point. And to the best of my knowledge, I was the only person in the UK looking at the changes that occur in the brain as the result of movement, breathing, and meditation seen specifically in yoga. So suddenly my whole course really took off. I couldn't actually complete the degree because I got so busy. And people started asking me to create a training course. And the Minded Institute was actually born not out of an idea in my own mind that I needed to do this, but by request. And in its first year, which I think was 2009, it was a 250-hour diploma, and it was just yoga therapy for mental health. And then from that, it very quickly became yoga therapy. And I also ended up doing a master's degree in medical physiology, having lived for 3 years between Boston and the UK, where I actually lectured to future doctors about yoga and mindfulness and how to integrate them into their work and how to also use them to nourish their own well-being in the very stressful environments they find themselves within. So I did this master's in medical physiology, and the Institute just went from strength to strength. You know, we became accredited by the British Council of Yoga Therapy. I brought in more lecturers to cover topics and flesh things out that I couldn't, in a way that I couldn't. A psychologist, a physiotherapist, a doctor, a philosopher, all of whom were also yoga therapists. And then we, also became accredited by the International Association of Yoga Therapists. That was only last year. It took us many years to do. We're the only one in the UK. And the program has become richer and richer. And I would say at this point, it really is like a master's degree. And when people apply, I tell them that, and then they don't think that I mean it. And I just had the ending ceremony for the group that started in 2020, and everybody goes around and shares. And about 5 of the students said, I remember when I spoke to you, Heather, and you said, this is like a master's degree. And I was like, yeah, I want that. I didn't think you meant it. It was such hard work. I'm so grateful I did it, but I did not take seriously that claim you made. So anyway, I could wax lyrical about this the entire time because it's been the last 13 years of my life. But I think that that's probably a useful introduction. It grew out of my own pain and suffering and then morphed into something much larger than me. I think we have 40 people involved in any one cohort, which is a lot.
That's incredible. The experience that you bring is incredible. And the way that you can really bridge the healthcare system and really draw on all of these different areas, bringing in your work in neuroscience and medical physiology. And it makes me think, how can we differentiate or understand the difference between yoga and a yoga therapist? Because I think as we are starting to see yoga accepted as something that can help treat mental illnesses and to work with more severe cases of depression and anxiety, we do need to have a certain standard for, not necessarily just walking into your neighborhood yoga studio, right? So what would you say
Yes.
are the key differences between a yoga teacher and a yoga therapist?
This is like the $1 million, or depending on where you're looking from, the million whatever currency question. I'd like to say, first of all, that the International Association of Yoga Therapists has put together a lovely document on the difference of scope of practice. So if you're really interested, go ahead and look up the difference between yoga and yoga therapy, scope of practice, IAYT of Google. Okay, so what's the difference? Well, first of all, a yoga therapist needs to do much more training than a yoga teacher, right? The standard still remains 200-hour training. Often those are done in an intensive form, which I also did myself, but I don't think is the best way to really understand how to impart it to other people. So that's the first thing. A yoga therapy training is kind of like a graduate degree for yoga therapists. For yoga teachers. On our training, we also take in health professionals, and you should be learning how to view illness in a multidimensional way through the kosha model. So for any of our listeners that are unaware of what the koshas are, it's a yogic system that sees the human being as divided into 5 layers or sheaths. One is the body sheath, one is the energy breath sheath, the mind sheath, the discernment sheath, which is more complicated, or wisdom sheath. Let's just think about it as how we make our core deep decisions, and then how we connect to bliss, or bliss sheath. And so we look at this 5-fold level of understanding and consider, okay, so like somebody's depressed, how does it affect their body? How is it affecting their breathing and their energy? How is it affecting their thought processes, their level of discernment, their connection to bliss? So that's something very specific to yoga therapy that a yoga teacher would not be doing. And then would go in considering a specific prescription based upon the understanding of what koshas were affected and how, and what somebody was most likely to actually engage in their daily life. A yoga therapist not only does training looking at that, but goes into depth understanding different health conditions, generally from both a yogic and a medical perspective, or when appropriate, a psychological perspective. They have to learn in-depth physiology. They, in any training worth its weight, should have case study work. And they learn therapeutic skills, hence the word therapy. So they learn about the process of doing official intakes. They learn about client relationships. They learn about how to hold the space in unique ways, just like any kind of therapist, psychotherapist, psychologist would do. How to inquire in specific ways, how to develop a health plan. And depending on how robust the training is, there will be big overlaps between this and what any other health professional would do in terms of recording what happens in each session, plan development, and also communication with somebody's health team if they're seeing other individuals. So it's a related but different animal than yoga teaching. Now, technically, yoga therapy is not a protected term in any country aside from Germany. Germany has actually done that. But one should, if one is seeking a yoga therapist, make sure that that yoga therapist has actually done a yoga therapy training and not self-declared themselves as such.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's a very good point. And I really like that you come at it from a perspective of this is what helped to heal you when you were seeking out something that actually has worked, which was yoga. So what did you find was the why that yoga practices were working for you, whereas maybe other, forms of treatment, which people may often associate with working with mental health, such as just doing talk therapy, wasn't necessarily helping you heal?
Okay, well, I want to add to that mindfulness meditation, which very much from the Buddhist tradition. I'm a practicing Buddhist. So what's the difference? First of all, for the meditation piece, I was able to start seeing through my thought patterns, which I was so wedded to, and learning how to calm my mind. And I think one of the things, and this is an overlap between yoga and Buddhism, is the ability to finally understand that suffering is self-created. And not everybody is ready to come to that realization. And I may not ever discuss that with clients, but that is the reality. Suffering is self-created. I mean, I am the survivor of many traumatic events that were external to me, but the constant rumination on those is occurring within me. The shift within my heart rate, the shaking and anxiety and tremors, all of which I've had in nightmares, they're still happening within me. So these traditions do point to that. And although that can feel sometimes like invalidating the external factors, it is also empowering, because as they are occurring within oneself, the answers for change and healing are within oneself. So that is somewhat distinct from talking therapy, right? Where the answers are in oneself, but you're having to do this more in a integrated way with somebody else. I guess you sort of do that in yoga therapy as well. You're communicating with somebody else. But there's something about how breath can alter brain functioning, which is huge. And probably it is more potent than the movement piece for most health conditions. Having said that, exercise, and I know that asana, the postures, is much more than exercise, and I don't want to be reductive, but it is also exercise. Exercise shows up for many health conditions in mild presentation form to moderate as good, especially for depression, or better than pharmaceuticals. And again, I'm not anti-pharmaceuticals, I'm just pro-evidence. So there's something to be said for the power of the movement, and breathing is profound. When you change oxygen and carbon dioxide levels, the brain responds immediately. Any change in oxygen requires our attention more so than almost any other shift in input, because 3 minutes without it and neurons can die. And so we can rely on all kinds of different practices and their capacity to shift brain functioning in both the moment, and if we are consistent in our practice over the long term, as a way to really change what happens within not only the brain, but therefore relatedly our psychological states. And some exciting research has been done on yoga showing that neurochemical changes occur with practice, and that these momentary neurochemical changes over time lead to shifts in actual networks and volume of brain structure. Now, I know that I'm not an expert in addictions, even though you do often have people here with addictions, and I don't want to get too much into it because it's not my bailiwick. However, there is therefore an obvious role for yoga in addictions, because the capacity to shift networks is very prominent. And just to add that dopamine spikes can be had through yoga to substitute the dopamine spikes that somebody may be craving as a result of coming off a substance of abuse or misuse, whatever you want to call it. So these are all reasons. Actually, I could go on and on. Sorry if I'm being too verbose.
Oh, no, please. I definitely don't want to interrupt. I love hearing you share. And I think, even if we're not talking specifically about addiction, what I find is so interesting is, the piece about healing trauma through the body, because we know that a lot of addictions at the root of those are trauma or, experiences that have not been processed. So is that something that you work with yoga therapy?
Yeah, very much. I specifically work with trauma populations. I work with, first and foremost, survivors of sexual abuse, whether it's childhood or adult. And we have more and more evidence and clinical input to show that, yes, the body is very important in working with PTSD. I think nobody has done more for popularizing that than Bessel van der Kolk, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who only a few years ago wrote The Body Keeps the Score. The title is the name of an article as well that he wrote a number of years back. And, it's interesting when we talk about trauma being within the body, right? Because it's not like your arm is specifically traumatized. What actually happens is the body is in different positions, for example, within the traumatic moment. And those positions are encoded within the brain. And so when one takes those positions again, these positions invoke those memories. Additionally, trauma, if it then does become PTSD, right? Because you can have a traumatic event and not present with later problems, right? It depends on your vulnerabilities, your age, how many traumatic events you've had. But if you present with PTSD, what happens is this marked shift in your startle response. Your heart rate will go very high in relationship to a trigger, or in more intensive situations will go quite low. Your heart rate variability will be reduced. And this is something maybe I should describe to people. Heart rate variability, it's a physiological concept. So we all have variation in our heart rate. And here's where I'm going to get a bit into the autonomic nervous system. This variation in the heart rate is the result of different factors. So first of all, the heart has what we call an intrinsic rhythm. We know the heart has a pacemaker, right? Some people need pacemakers actually created and put into their heart later in life, right? So the heart has its own internal pacemaker in the sinoatrial node, and it has its own beat. And then you have what we call extrinsic factors that influence the heart rate. And one of the most important extrinsic factors is the impact of the autonomic nervous system. So you have the sympathetic nervous system, which we colloquially call fight and flight. And that's responsible for increasing heart rate in terms of cardiovascular. It's responsible for many things. And then from the parasympathetic nervous system, which colloquially we refer to as rest and digest, or these days also tend and befriend, because it's where we can socialize and connect when we're in that parasympathetic state, has one primary nerve, the vagus, which comes out of the brainstem, connects to the heart. And every time it releases a chemical to the heart, which it does in a punctuated way continuously, it slows down the heart rate. So if you have a strong autonomic nervous system that's highly flexible, you will have a pretty high variation in heart rate, because what will happen is sympathetic nerves will speed up the heart rate, and then the parasympathetic nerve, the vagus, will slow it down. And so anybody with a good variation will have that, with a good flexibility in their autonomic nervous system will have variation as a result of those two. What we see in PTSD and in other mental health conditions, but PTSD is probably where we see it most acutely, is this real reduction in heart rate variability. Generally, the heart rate at rest will just be higher without this punctuated period of lower heart rate from the vagus. The vagus is generally not as effective in slowing it down. And this speaks of an inflexibility in the nervous system, whereby when somebody gets frightened, they remain in a heightened state of fear for a long period of time. And alternatively, when they finally rest, they feel like they're going to collapse. They're not able, for example, to go around the house quickly and get ready for work. And then, in the car ride, if it's not stressful, just relax. And then if there's an important meeting, the nervous system lifts up to mobilize and meet that. And then, when there's no stress in the environment to come down, they will remain in a more heightened state. Now, this whole description is relevant to PTSD and yoga, because one of the things that we understand that yoga is so potent at doing is increasing flexibility within the autonomic nervous system, which we tend to measure with increased levels of heart rate variability. And breathing has a phenomenal impact on that, because actually, when you inhale, you increase the amount of sympathetic signaling to the heart. And when you exhale, you increase the amount of parasympathetic signaling. So any practice you do where you elongate your exhalation, which we do often with Ujjayi breath, you take in an inhale, is necessarily going to increase that slowing process, and the variability increases. And then the nervous system becomes more flexible in the moment and over time. And we also start to see, in conjunction with being in different postures where somebody feels relaxed because there is that parasympathetic input from the breathing, that positions that may have been scary and encoded as threatening can start to be coupled with something non-threatening. And in addition, the parts of the brain that will have what we call aberrant activity associated with self-concepts will over time also start to change. And people will not only have often a greater sense of esteem, but a more realistic interpretation of their body and less fear around it.
It's so powerful to consider just the ability to heal and create new neural pathways with these practices. How would you define trauma? Because there's, of course,
Well,
a big spectrum.
Trauma as opposed to PTSD is really any event that overwhelms somebody's capacity in a notable way to manage that psychologically and physiologically. So what is traumatic for me may not be traumatic for you, and vice versa, right? And then we often call that, in the field of traumatology, we call that trauma with a little t, like things that for me are uniquely traumatic. And then we have the things that for almost every person would be a traumatic event, the most common of which is rape. Rape presents with the highest incidence of PTSD. Any kind of attack, it could be emotional abuse, genocide, combat stress, which is probably second to rape in terms of the greatest cause of PTSD. But, once you cannot in a moment consider how to work with a possibility and your nervous system is absolutely overwhelmed and you go into a state of real heightened hyperarousal or freezing, this is traumatic for you. But that does not mean that you are going to have PTSD.
Yeah, and how would you consider the effect? I'm just curious, like over the last couple of years, I think a lot of people have been subjected to not necessarily trauma, but intense, prolonged periods of stress and uncertainty with the pandemic. So what have you observed either in your clients or just, kind of people in general in how this pandemic has been affecting people? Because people are saying that, there's the actual pandemic as it relates to COVID, but also this sort of emerging mental health crisis.
Yeah, I mean, the mental health crisis, I believe, is worse than COVID itself. And I'm not saying that flippantly. I take COVID very seriously, I saying that highlights how massive the mental health piece is going to be. And I think it's going to leave its stamp for a generation on us. God, I would need to go through a list. So first of all, and this is directly related to COVID, people who have been hospitalized as a result, some studies have shown up to 25% of people presenting with PTSD. Now, when you are hospitalized, there's a high likelihood of having PTSD, but that is definitely higher than the normative stat. And the reason in part is because through much of the pandemic, you could not receive any support in person from your loved ones, right? So the isolation. And then let's come to the isolation overall for human beings. So this is a unique feature of this pandemic, which we have never seen before on a global scale with any other incident that has occurred. Human beings by nature self-regulate, most of us, through interaction. And through isolation, we become much more susceptible to a host of mental health issues. And I want to come back right now to the autonomic nervous system and add in a concept so that I can really clarify the potential impact of that on individuals and on societies. So Stephen Porges, who it looks like you know who he is from here. Yeah. Stephen Porges is famous for his development of something called polyvagal theory. And polyvagal theory is a broad theory with many aspects, but what I'll focus on is that Porges says rather than there being fight and flight and rest and digest, there's actually three potentials within the nervous system, the autonomic. So we have fight and flight, right, which is sympathetically mediated. And then we have two, which are mediated by the vagus rather than talking about the entire parasympathetic nervous system. So one is this rest and digest aspect, which the ventral vagus, which is arguably, there's some controversy within the community, specific to mammals. The part of the nervous system within rest and digest. And also that part of the nervous system doesn't only calm down the heart rate, but it is connected with various aspects of us physiologically that allow us to socialize, like within the larynx, allowing voice modulation for us to show empathy. Oh, I'm so sorry. Or joy, that allows us to connect. The movement of the face and having appropriate reactive facial expressions, or what we call social cognition. And also, it's connected to a tiny muscle in the middle ear, which allows the fine tuning of hearing to an individual so that our listening is really honed, right? And he calls that the social engagement network. And through the social engagement network, we bond, we feel safe, we feel well. And also when the vagus is more active, it has the ventral vagus, it has a positive effect on the cardiovascular system, the immune system, etc. And just to add, even though it's not as relevant, the last part of this polyvagal network is the dorsal vagus, which is responsible for the freeze response that we see in PTSD. Now, what happens when we don't have social engagement is that kind of support that we receive and activation of that entire network that we would have, which keeps us psychologically and even physically well, is compromised. And so we are given to states of depression and fear, with the exception of those people, and I think it's really important to note this, that actually have a really hard time with human relationship, and that will often be people that have been repeatedly traumatized within that, where actually that sense of space from other human beings can be a relief, because finding safe connection is hard and the social engagement network is a bit compromised. And I can say that was me at the beginning of the pandemic. I like some space due to my past, even though I've done a lot of work. And I found the social isolation actually curative. And I just want to say that because not everybody falls into the camp of having struggled through it. In addition to that, people have not had access in the same way to health services that they did before, because we did need to place most of the resources in the hands of helping those with COVID, especially before we had vaccines and when it was rife through society and we didn't know how to protect ourselves, and for example, the way that we do now. So many people did not receive help. And when they finally did, they would show up in much more acute states than they had in the past. And then we also have to think about the developing population, our children who've had this really stemmed normal way of connecting with their peers and growing up, and the impact that that's going to have with them over a lifetime. And we don't yet know, but I know that many of us are deeply concerned. I could go on and on. I'll just add 2 other points. As a mode to manage states of stress, including being isolated, being scared, many people increased their use of substances. So substance misuse had increased. And I think The Economist was the first to publish a piece on this in April 2020, showing that in the UK, where I currently live, there was this high level increase in purchasing of alcohol. The rate of eating disorders increased significantly as well. And actually, one more thing to add is, the stress of either worrying that one is not going to be well, especially for older people. I know that my mother has really experienced depressive states because she's in her 70s and she's been frightened. She's hardly seen any friends in over 2 years. And that's been incredibly difficult for her. And also, the terrible grieving of losing loved ones or being afraid of losing loved ones. But I think one of the worst is grieving and not even having been able to say goodbye, which was happening a lot in the earlier part of the pandemic. So, we just have the perfect storm, and we already had epidemic levels of mental health issues across the globe. And now what we find is where we'll have to pick up the pieces, and manage this. I think mental health and also cancer care was extremely disrupted, are the 2 areas that are probably most present in the press. I'm not sure if there aren't other conditions that really need highlighting too.
Yeah, and I think in some ways it's good for people to understand, and see that the statistics are, it's not that this is something unique to the individual, that because of the way that we are designed as humans, it's natural
Mhm.
that we're starting to experience these mental health conditions, or, people are developing addictions. And so one of the questions that came up as you were speaking, can we fulfill that need for social interaction through screens? Like, is it, with what you know about that body of work? I mean, can we
Mhm.
fulfill that social interaction just by
Mhm.
observing people?
It's a really good question. I mean, we would need research to clarify this, and I'm sure there has been some. I haven't looked. I know that at the beginning of the pandemic, I was running this thing called HealthFlix, and where we had many, many leaders in mind body medicine offering free talks or free practices. And I interviewed Stephen Porges, and he was talking about how to better engage the social engagement network via screen by being very melodious with voice, being very conscious of looking forward and not to the side, of gesticulating actively, and trying to mimic to the best of our ability what we would do in daily life, and maybe even amp it up a little, almost to a cartoonish degree, but not freakishly cartoonish, so that we
Mm.
could have that. But what I think we can do, and this comes back to the yoga and yoga therapy piece, is because yoga increases vagal activation, right? And we infer that from heart rate variability research. If we do practices that are going to support that, we should be activating our social engagement network, even in the absence of other people. And I was advocating for this throughout the beginning of the pandemic. Make sure that you're practicing so that you have that sense of connection being experienced, even if you are alone. And alongside that, we can use the physical, sorry, the precepts of yoga, or the axioms of yoga that are saying, we're all connected, we're all one. And using that mental construct alongside the physiological changes to feel connected. And I think that that helped a lot of people. And likewise, if you're exercising, doing yoga, or anything else, and keeping your endorphins up, you're going to fare better, and you're going to be less vulnerable to mental health challenges if you're stronger. We call that prehabilitation.
Absolutely. And I'd
Yeah.
love to know too, because you have been really driving these conversations into the healthcare space, how has the conversation about yoga been received? Have you noticed a lot of changes over the years that maybe people are more receptive in the medical space?
Mm,
I was thinking about this particularly when you were bringing up the koshas, and wondering if
yes.
this is also being received in those spaces, or if you have to sort of be intentional with how you present yoga in certain settings.
Since 2007, when I first became a yoga therapist, I have definitely seen a big change. In part, that's the result of more people practicing yoga. It's trendier. And so there's also appreciation within healthcare settings. And many of the people that are practicing are health professionals. The biggest predictor of referring somebody to yoga would be that they actually practice themselves and they see benefit. Okay. So that's helpful. And we have some great surveys, none better than in the United States, showing this real increased amount of practice of yoga. And specifically, the United States has actually looked at the practice of yoga specifically for health conditions. So that's wonderful. At the Minded Institute, about 40% of the people that we take in are coming from the health sector rather than the yoga sector. Again, speaking to that understanding. And I think that as we develop a greater awareness of how much the mind influences health conditions, we're looking more at mind body medicine. There's this whole field of psychoneuroimmunology, which is essentially looking at how mental states impact the brain and the entire immune system. And so, as the hard, solid, exciting, sometimes genetic research on that is heightened, so is our understanding that things like meditation, yoga, movement based therapies in general have a real role. Yoga also is unique because it has so many aspects associated with it, from looking at behavior to thought processes to movement to breath to meditation. And so it slots really nicely into this burgeoning appreciation of needing biopsychosocial approaches for almost all health conditions. So that's another reason. And then finally, there are those of us that are actively pioneering for it. I mean, my friend Göran Boll in Sweden has been the most successful person in the world. He created Meta Yoga, and Meta Yoga now exists in over 20% of hospitals and clinics throughout the entire country of Sweden. I mean, congratulations, Ron. I
Wow.
hope you're hearing me singing your praises. He's amazing. In the UK, we have a social prescribing scheme. Social prescribing is being exported around the world. It was developed here. It is the appreciation that loneliness is a risk factor for health conditions for two reasons. One, because we tend to eat poorly and exercise less if we are alone, and also use substances like alcohol more frequently. And so if we have a community where we feel safe, we're more likely to engage in positive health behaviors, thereby being healthier. And likewise, there's an actual regulation of the cardiovascular nervous system that happens when we are in positive, safe relationship. So recognizing this, that it is better for human beings and that it can reduce the pressure on the health services for up to 20 to 40%, that's what research shows. We have all these schemes that individuals can be referred into activity groups as part of their prescription. And that might be gardening, singing, art projects, or yoga. And my
Love
other
that.
organization, the Yoga and Healthcare Alliance, has created a social prescribing yoga program, which was evaluated. We had more than 300 people come through the program. And now we have more than 300 teachers throughout the UK that offer that in different parts of the health system or within the community sector. And additionally, other countries like India, of course, they have an entire ministry associated with yoga, right, that falls under what they call Ayush. And it's part of their mandate that in rural communities, traditional Indian sciences like yoga are made available as part of healing modalities, both to honor those traditions and because they're cost effective. So again, like many of these topics, I could speak all day.
I love it.
But yes, and something we're currently trying to do, and I'm announcing it, but I don't know if it's going to come to fruition, specifically at the Minded Institute. We recognize that trying to get yoga therapy recognized as a veritable health profession is difficult. It's a very long road, and I know because I have been treading this path already for 13 years, and I have a sense of the governance and policy and evidence base and money that you need to write all the reports in order for this to happen, not to mention the curriculums across universities, etc. So we are considering right now, and hopefully we will be successful in our process of adding a certain amount of hours to our diploma course to also make it a psychotherapy training for those that wish to do it. And people will therefore not just be yoga therapists, but psychotherapists. And because psychotherapy is a well-recognized profession, it is within healthcare. It may not be necessarily adopted within the NHS far and wide, because the NHS is limited in how many psychotherapists it employs, but it does, but it will be within the healthcare realm very specifically. So fingers crossed we succeed. I think we're the only yoga therapy training organization in the world doing something like that. I think. If I'm wrong and you're listening, reach out and tell me.
That's incredible. Congratulations, first of all. I mean, on everything that you've done, really. But I wonder, has the pandemic, do you think because now there's so much more conversation happening around mental health, do you think this pandemic could actually be pushing that forward faster?
Yes and no. I think that more people have taken up yoga because they needed a way to manage their mental health. And we do have studies from different countries evidencing that people who were doing this actually maintained greater health. But at the same time, the reality is that we are faced with deficits in healthcare spending throughout the globe that we've never seen before. And so very few systems are going to have the capital to invest. And that's tricky because there's a recognition that mind-body programs are essential. In fact, what happened is the pandemic exposed that we have, like in many countries in the world, about 70% of the budget is being absorbed for long-term lifestyle conditions, many of which could be prevented or managed more effectively through strategies that people do on their own at home, maybe after, they've seen a yoga therapist or doing yoga classes, therefore significantly reducing health expenditure nationally, right? So there's that, okay, we need this. And at the same time, it's like, but we have so little money, like we don't even have any money in order to spend experimenting on how that works. And even if we know it works, right now, 100% of our funding needs to be in, now managing the populations that weren't receiving proper care throughout the entire pandemic, that are acutely unwell, and which yoga is not enough, not even close to, right? And cancer is the one that receives the most press. Cancer care has been sadly underfunded and under-resourced in terms of staff as well. And so we face that tension between, we definitely need to shift to a model where things like yoga are embedded in the health system, and we have no money at all. So how do you transform something, and how do you add something when you have this acutely unwell population you must manage, and then these other needs? I wouldn't want to be a health secretary in any country right now.
Yeah. So how do we, are there studies that are happening, or is there any research, or are you kind of working towards getting funding for that in any way, or is that outside of?
We're certainly looking, because also the other hat that I wear is that I am the secretariat for the all-party parliamentary group on yoga and society. And
Wow.
our hope is to be able to create a report demonstrating the economic case. The economic case is essential, basically in any country, in order for yoga to really be embedded into the health system. I mean, we may wish for something grander, like they recognize it's good for people, but it has to make financial sense. And so we need to raise money for that. Is there funding? There's always funding somewhere, but there's less funding, I would say, through obvious channels. Places that we can look right now are like funding options for how do we treat long COVID, vestige of the pandemic, and maybe not just a vestige, because people are still getting long COVID, but I think less so than before. And the health systems are also inundated with people that have this condition with a limited understanding of how to treat it, and such a multiplicity of presentations. It's not like chronic fatigue, which is all often compared to, in that it's so vast, it can affect the heart, the kidneys. But I think that we are looking as a globe into how to treat long COVID. And so that's an area that we need to demonstrate within yoga and yoga therapy, that there can be some efficacy. And I'm actually involved right now in a funding application around that. I can't really say more except that.
Oh, well, that's really good to hear. Yeah. And I find it really interesting what you were saying about the social prescriptions. I mean, some of these things that are so readily available and free, like you mentioned gardening, which I would really love to hear more about, if that's something that you do research on practices that involve being connected with nature. I know multiple people during the pandemic who have taken up gardening as what they have said has been the most transformative therapy, that ability to connect and be fully present with nature. Is that something at all that you're researching, or is that part of the prescription?
It's definitely part of social prescribing. And the National Academy for Social Prescribing very much pushes the relationship between humans and nature, and recognizes the value, and is invested in research. And by invested, I mean both has a connection to it and actually financially invested. They're putting money towards that. I don't really look into that very much myself. I am on the yoga front. As a human being, though, I am deeply interested in that, and feel unequivocally that my connection with nature makes a world of difference in terms of my mental health. I just got back from 6 weeks in the Canary Islands. I was only off for 2 of those weeks, during the Christmas period. The rest of the time I was working. And I can tell you, I came back feeling blissful, even though I was doing the same work days, because I was near the ocean and it was warm. And now I'm back in the city of London, a great city, but it is a city and it's cold and I don't want to go out as much. Thank God for my dog that makes sure I have to, walk outside the park 3 times a day. But yes, I think there is a big connection. And so there can be this overlap of people going outside to practice yoga. It's potent. That's what the ancient yogis did anyway, right? Or they were in
Absolutely.
caves, but a cave is part of nature.
It is.
Yeah.
So you've really had the extremes from growing up in New York City to like going off and, well, I guess London, not so much, but have you kind of in your own experiment noticed that there was a big shift between how you were feeling in terms of your nervous system in the city and then?
Yes. I mean, I lived like in the back hills of Burma for a number of years, which is the antithesis of Manhattan. Yeah, there's a huge difference. And I keep asking myself why I'm ending up in cities because I'm not a city girl. I'm really not. I'm used to it. I can thrive in the city, at least outwardly, because again, that's where I grew up. But I'm definitely more of a country person. I'm not interested in bars, I'm not interested in clubs. I've done enough art galleries for the rest of my life.
Mhm.
Just bring me out to the ocean, to a beautiful park, to a nice sunset. And that's my bliss. I don't need all the other things.
I was actually curious to ask you if when you were staying at Buddhist monasteries in Southeast Asia, if you ever considered pursuing that path and just staying within the monastery and.
Yeah, I wanted to be a Buddhist nun. That's why I did the master's degree in Buddhist Studies. I really wanted to be a Buddhist nun. But what happened was I did this master's degree and I actually fell madly in love and I was feeling better than I had. And, the trappings of love, I shouldn't say that because love is so wonderful, but it did pull me out of my desire to return to the monastery. And then I got engaged in helping others, outside of the monastery. But I regularly consider it going back because I think for me, it is the best thing I ever did. I know a lot of individuals that I connect with when I say that, and they like, no, it's, the Minded Institute and helping all these people. And I said, well, yeah, but for me, the best thing I ever did was live in the monastery. And I believe in the Buddhist philosophy of, samsara and enlightenment and all of those things. So if that's what I believe, I should probably be meditating and undoing my karma, right? Um, but the
Well, I
world
think,
draws you in. The world
yeah, and I was
draws
going to say many people have benefited from you coming out. And it's just, I think it's absolutely amazing that you have devoted yourself to really studying, in that way, but then also applying everything that we know now and everything you've studied in neuroscience and
you.
physiology and psychotherapy, because you're able to weave it all together in what you're creating.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. It's useful, I think, for other people to be able to have me show them how to look through all these different vistas when they talk to other people, actually. And that answers the question you had asked before that I didn't get to, which is, do you have to speak to different people in different ways about yoga? And you absolutely do. If you want to embed it into the health system, you need to be able to speak from the psychological, the spiritual, the academic, the medical. And so by having all those different trainings and then sharing that with other people, then I feel we can influence the health system more profoundly. Right? You have to have the right language and the right ideology to convince somebody rather than, they're polarized here and you're polarized here. You'll never meet.
Absolutely. It's like speaking people's
Yeah.
language when you introduce something new.
Exactly, exactly. And my colleague, Marlisa Sullivan has actually written this book called Understanding Yoga Therapy. And in it, she talks about how essential it is in order to help your clients that actually find a common language and that
Mhm.
you learn to speak their dialogue. And it's the same with anybody that you want to have understand the value of yoga and, tick the policy box. Yes, we will fund.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think too, since I know there will also be yoga teachers that are listening, and sometimes we have to remind ourselves it's not just about imparting everything we know on other people, but really finding ways to meet people where they're at for the most benefit to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is actually another aspect, I think, that differentiates yoga from yoga therapy. Because when we are teaching yoga, we are transmitting whatever we believe and whatever we understand and know through our training and through our bodies to somebody else. As a yoga therapist, you are ascertaining somebody's worldview and you're really trying to speak within that. And so you can't sit there and say stoically, this is what yoga is, but rather you say, this is how this human being needs to hear the aspects of yoga siphoned through their reality. And so, like when we talk about the yamas and niyamas, for example, we may do so using very different language and take a little bit of license around it. Yeah.
I love that. Well, this has been such an insightful conversation, and I'm just so grateful that we could connect and hear about everything that you're offering. What would be a nice way for people who are interested in learning more about your work? Do you offer anything online for people who are outside of the UK,
Mhm.
or what resources should we know about?
So first of all, people can do lots of continuing professional development courses with us. Many are still online, so they can go to the Minded Institute website and they can see that. I have a free YouTube channel where I've loaded practices. During much of the pandemic and lockdown periods, I was offering free breathing practices and explaining the physiology behind why I was offering what I was offering. So they can definitely go and check that out as well. We have on-demand short courses, I think 5 of them in different topics that people can do at their own pace. And if they're interested in the work of the Yoga and Healthcare Alliance, they can check out that website and we'll get a clearer understanding of what we're doing there. And finally, last May with the Give Back Yoga Foundation, we did a conference called Wellness After COVID, a yoga and healthcare symposium. And all of the recordings from that with world leaders in different areas are also available for purchase. And that's on the Give Back Yoga website. So they can check that out too. There's a lot of different ways to reach out.
Amazing. Yeah, when you said Health Flicks, I was like, that's the prescription I need instead of
Oh,
Netflix.
and HealthFlix. See, I forgot that. HealthFlix is still live, and there's like 150 something talks from leading experts, and those are all free.
I love that. And I'll be sure to link all of that in the show notes too, so people have access to that.
Thank
Well,
you so much. It's lovely speaking with you, Mary. I really enjoyed it.
thank you so much, Heather. And I hope I can connect with you in person sometime soon.
That would be wonderful. Thank you.